Good morning, Lisa. Thanks for hopping on with me this morning. I'm actually pretty excited about our conversation today. It's not that often we get to talk about something that people need to be talking about that they're not often talking about. Before we launch in, though, why don't you share a little bit about your role here at Raymond?
Good morning. It's so nice to see you, and I'm excited about the topic. I am Raymond's leader of state and local tax, and I've been working with state and local tax for over 20 years, probably over 25 years, and it is a dynamic area, and it's an area that's I'll say often overlooked and misunderstood. So I'm excited about our conversation today.
Great. One of the things that, we often talk about with our friends is the sorts of things that keep them up at night. This is one of those topics that should keep them up at night, but oftentimes it's not top of mind for them. And especially as I start to think about our friends from around the world that are clients of the HLB network or just friends. And the topic here is, what do you do if you sell things into the US? Are there taxes that should be on your radar? Are you dodging these things? And I think about this partially because states are so aggressively pursuing revenue now. So let's start off just why should our friends around the world be thinking about US sales tax? Why should it be on their radar?
It's you're right. The states are getting better at their due diligence and spending much more of their budgets on doing sales tax discovery and audits. So there's been just a flurry of increase of activity around sales tax from the U.S. state side. I mean, we've seen audits increase by they're double what they were 5 years ago. But often what happens is sales tax isn't thought of until there's a notice or there's an audit or something like that. And really it should be on anyone's mind who's selling product to a location within the US. And we just find that it's generally not on people's radars. And I think for our non-US friends, oftentimes it's not on their radar because they might not be familiar with the system. By the system, I mean how the US imposes sales tax and how it's a state by state requirement, um, and that they just don't understand the basic rules of how they're supposed to comply. And oftentimes, what we find, I think the key takeaway from it is whether it's a non-U.S. entity or a U.S. entity, when you're selling product in the U.S., you need a sales tax strategy to assess if there's any risk and to address any risk that might be there.
So thinking about the system, I know many of our friends are familiar with things like value-added tax and GST, or they're relatively consistent across sometimes even international venues. We've got over 13,000 taxing jurisdictions in the US. Talk a little bit about the difference between our systems and what our friends may be used to.
That's a great point, right? Like people are often shocked when we say there's 13,000 different sales taxing jurisdictions. And people are like, how does that happen when there's only 50 states and only 45 that impose a sales tax? Well, the local jurisdictions also have separate rules and separate rates. So that's kind of one of the first items that shows the distinction between US sales tax and what I'll call what is typically considered VAT, value added tax that other countries might have. And oftentimes we find taxpayers just think they're the same, that they're similar. And in some regards, they are similar in that they're a tax on a transaction and usually based on gross receipts, but they're also vastly different. So I think oftentimes there's this misconception that, well, it's just sales tax. It's the same thing as VAT. We know how to address that, and we know which rules would make us subject to the sales
Mhm.
tax when actually it's vastly different. So what's working in someone's home country or a couple of countries where they're doing business likely doesn't translate to how they should be approaching sales tax in the US.
So when we think about the trigger, I always think about, do we have employees places? Do we have real estate someplace? Do I have a sales office? But that's not really it, is it?
Oh, and that's a great point that besides not being aware of the system, oftentimes we find that a lot of our clients, a lot of our non-US friends aren't even aware that they've met the requirements to have to consider sales tax. So in the US, uh, there is an economic presence standard that states that impose a sales tax will look at to say, do you have to require or comply with our rules? And it's generally based on a volume of sales dollars. So if you have $100,000 of sales to a state, that state could say you are subject to our sales tax rules. Sometimes it's by volume of transactions, like maybe 200, but states have moved away from that just to mostly focus on volume of sales. So when you think about it, someone could be selling to the US, not tracking how much they're selling to one particular state, and not even realize that they've created nexus and that they're out of compliance because it wasn't even on their radar to begin with.
So when you think about how to correct this and the cost of inaction, one tactic is, I suppose, just address your risk by ignoring it, right? Keep your head in the sand and hope you don't get caught. But that creates a lot of exposure. I mean, it's not just the back taxes that are owed. There's oftentimes some pretty draconian penalties and interest and all that.
That is absolutely correct. So for most states, if not all states that impose a sales tax, if they find you on discovery, they are going to impose penalty, and that penalty can range from about 20% up to 50% plus interest. And if they can go back as many years as when you first set up Nexus. So maybe the first time
Mhm.
that you had $100,000 of sales into that state. There's no limit on how far they can go back.
Wow.
And and sales tax, when it's done correctly, is an in and out. It's an administrative burden for a client. But when it's done wrong and a state was to discover an entity, that money is coming right out of your bottom line. It's a direct hit to the bottom line. And the average sales tax rate in the US right now is, I want to say, about 7.5%.
Hmm.
Plus, if you had, 20, 40% penalty plus interest, that's coming right out of your bottom line. So that the issue is greater than just complying to comply. It is about taking control of your financial performance and your reporting, or at least knowing what risk you have out there.
Yeah, because you're right. It should be passed through to the customer normally, and this removes that. You typically, if you're going back 10 years because the state's after you, it's pretty hard to go back for your customers 10 years. So it's all on you. So let's just say that one of our friends is listening to this and say, what do we do? How do we take this complex thing and make it simple? How would they go about chatting with you on that?
And that is such a valid concern that I think a lot of companies face, right? It's everyone's plates are full. So now here seems this insurmountable issue to deal with. 13,000 taxing
Mhm.
jurisdictions, 45 different states, different rules. And I think that puts a lot of taxpayers into the sense of, I'll just ignore it. I'll deal with it later. It's too complex. It's too voluminous. And we have a great way. We've worked with a lot of US, non US clients to say, let's put this into a framework where you can drive the process and understand the risk, because knowledge is power, right? So, what we do is we build a matrix based off of the taxpayer sales. We note for them where they have nexus. We know whether or not, nexus is just one piece. What's the next piece that's really important in making these decisions is, but what does that equate to for a liability? So if you had a bunch of sales to a state in one year, but not for the next couple of years, maybe 10 years isn't that overwhelming for you. But in another state, it might be. So state by state, we build this matrix. Where do you have nexus? What does that mean from a tax liability? What does your prior history look like? And what is that risk, right? What level does that rise to? And generally, what we find out with all of them that we've done is that it kind of shakes out into three levels. There'll be some states that are just a high priority, they just seem to be on fire. We calculate the tax and the interest that's and the penalty that's due, and it's an amount that the company is uncomfortable if that state was to contact them and ask for that amount, that they would not, that would cause some pain in writing that check. And that's usually a couple of states, handful of states. I'm pointing like that because that's at the top of my matrix.
Yep.
Then in the middle, where quite a few states will be states where there's exposure and there's some liability, but maybe they're not as hot. Maybe it would be okay if the state came and asked them for a check for that amount. And then there's some states that are just there might not be nexus, so there's a very low liability. And basically, right from that, from sharing that and creating that for clients, they can engage and start making great business decisions about how do they want to address any exposure that they have. So we take the complex, put it in a framework that allows them, without having to become sales tax experts, to start driving business decisions.
So once you have the matrix, and I suppose it's a red pill or blue pill type decision as you're deciding what to do with it. Do any of these states ever have any kind of tax holidays or any kind of relief from the penalties and interest if you voluntarily disclose?
Absolutely. So that is another reason not to keep our heads down and kind of hide
Mhm.
from this issue, is that the states offer a programs where if you voluntarily come to them and I'll just say confess that you were not in full compliance, that they will say, we did not have to expend any of our money to find you. What we're going to do is we're going to limit that look back. So instead of going back
Mhm.
10 years, they're going to say, we'll only go back 4, and we're going to waive all the penalties. And in return, you promise to be a good taxpayer on a go forward basis. So there is a lot of incentive to be the one driving the process instead of being reactive. When a state contacts you and you lose your ability
Mhm.
to fight off all the penalties, and then you're under their deadlines and their pressure of performing under their time frame.
So I know the U.S. markets are highly desirable for an awful lot of our friends around the world, right? There's a lot of opportunity here. And so, as people build out their strategies for getting into the market and taking advantage of, hopefully lucrative opportunities for them, what's the strategic imperative regarding sales tax? I mean, what do you really want people to come away from this conversation with?
Hoping after this conversation that it's a red flag or a bell, at least it's ringing off in their heads, that they're like, I know there's something that we're supposed to address, and that they realize that it's not optional, that our any income tax treaty does not provide protection in this area, and that it's real money. Like they should be interested in it, because again, if it's not done right, it's a hit right to your bottom line, and that there are structured ways to help
Hmm.
manage it, resolve it, and be proactive about it. Even if you've not been in compliance for 10 years, there is a process to help put that into a manageable way forward. Or if it's something that you're just starting to do with sales into the US, how to be proactive about it. But I think the biggest takeaway from that is none of that requires you to be a sales tax expert. It's complex, it's very detail oriented. That's what we do, and we love doing it. So don't get overwhelmed with that thought process of it. Think of it as we're creating a plan of how to move forward and prioritize and take deliberate action as you start selling into the US or continue selling to US states.
Makes a lot of sense, Lisa. So, as I think about, what our friends should be thinking about if they're not thinking about it already, it starts off really almost by running a report on sales by jurisdiction, right? And, having that chance to reach out to someone like you and say, hey, here's what it looks like for this year or the last 10 years or the last 50 years, maybe, depending on how long they've been doing it. And then you're able to fairly quickly take a look, right, and say, yeah, you nothing to worry about, or whoa, we better do something here.
That's a great point, to get it to do start a high level analysis to say, should this even be on your radar? Getting a list of sales by state, so where they ship to, it's really easy for us to take a look and say, oh, we think there's an issue here, or no, you're good, but here's how you should proceed and monitor on a go forward basis. It's a fairly, I'll say, simple way to get the process started. And we're always happy to help people. Again, we're passionate about it and want to make sure that clients are doing all they can to protect their bottom line. So we love the opportunity to connect and take that quick look.